It all started with a trial, out of curiosity, but now we are hooked. It kills us slowly, flesh and soul. It's the master, and we are, ladies and gentlemen, its slaves. Welcome to Identity, ladies and gentlemen. Chapter 3, How Addictions Work, or the Addicted Soul, Part 1, Introduction. Have you ever done the evil you didn't want to do? Promising after that never again, just to fall back into it for God only knows the number of times? Have you ever asked yourself, what is an addiction? What makes us addicts? How does an addiction work? What are some specific types of addictions? And finally, how can we solve the problem of addictions? Well, let's dive into the subject. Addiction comes from the Latin word addicere, which means to assign to, holding its traditional innocuous meaning as a habitual activity or interest, often with positive purpose. In the times of Shakespeare, it was defined as the passionate thing someone does with all his being, or according to other sources, an addict will be a mentee signing an engagement to follow the teaching of his mentor. It is, however, in the Roman Empire that an addict, addictus in Latin, was considered as an individual who, having defaulted on a debt, was assigned to his creditor as a slave. It's from this that we derive the conventional definition of an addiction. In summary, it's a slave-master relationship. So, what is an addiction in the 21st century? To put it in simple terms, an addiction is the compulsive indulgence into a behavior, despite the negative consequences the behavior has on the addicted individual and to those around him. But we all take in substances or indulge into some forms of activities. Does it mean that we are all addicted to those things? Of course not. We all eat food, but we're not all addicted to it. Even healthy activities like exercising can become addictive, by the way. So how do we draw the line between a normal substance consumption or activity and an addiction? For any substance or activity to become addictive, there must be pain, craving, and relapse involved. Pain comes from the negative consequences the indulgence into the behavior has on the addicted individual and to those around him. Craving comes from the rewiring of certain brain structure due to the indulgence into the behavior. And relapse comes as a result of the inability to resist the withdrawal symptoms. Note that a combination of these three characteristics will constitute an addiction. Dr. Gabor Mate, an addiction expert, even moves further by saying that even if you claim to be passionate about carrying on a particular activity, and even when society is on your side, by the moment these three characteristics are present, you can consider yourself as an addict. In other words, your passion must cause no harm to anybody. He uses a good question in order to find out whether or not you are addicted. Who is in charge? You or the substance or the behavior? If the answer is not you, then you are addicted. Let's now move into what I call the perfect combination, or the addiction reaction. As an amateur of chemistry, I permit myself, ladies and gentlemen, to give you what we can call an addiction reaction. In an addiction reaction, the elements are susceptible organisms, a substance with addictive potentials, and factors likely to favor the reaction will be the environment, the age, and stress. Like in a chemical reaction, a good dosage of everything will give the perfect product, or, to put it plainly, of addictions. But please, do not reduce addiction to a simple equation. I just do it for convenience. Having said this, let's move deep into the causes of addiction. How is it possible that a necessity like food consumption can become the door to our graves? The answer lies in pain and pleasure. Assuming that we all have an idea of what physical or psychological pain is, let's talk of infant for a moment. Although we are all vulnerable to suffering, infants haven't developed a particular mechanism to counter pains or are still in its development. Compared to adults, they are extremely vulnerable to suffering. This has to do with the fact that man, compared to other animals and because of some evolutionary reasons, is born premature, which has some implications. Firstly, it means we get less from our parents in terms of genes, and although we might resemble them and reproduce most of their habits, most of who we are in the future will be determined by the society in which we live. Secondly, premature babies are extremely vulnerable to environmental threats and will need the help and support of elderly ones to be able to survive. The amount of time they need for support will depend on how well their survival and defense mechanisms have been developed. A snake, for instance, can hear, see, move and hunt straight from the moment it's born, so it will be independent from birth, although there are few exceptions like pythons and vipers. Young infants, on the other hand, cannot defend themselves, which makes them extremely dependent on adults around them for support. If our parents' genes represent the seed, the environment represents the sun, water, and the daycare given for the germination of that seed. What we become in life is mostly a reflection of what we have been feeding on in society. The seed tells us which plant will germinate, but the environment tells us what the quality of the germinated plant will be. A neglected or abused child will either be inauthentic to get loved or will look for something else to soothe his pain. And these pain suitors have the same impact on those brain regions that are important for our survival. Those same brain regions involved in addictions. So, let's look into that. Cause number 2. The neurochemistry of addictions. As many neuroscientists will say, the brain is the powerful complex system, and up till now the most complicated and misunderstood biological structure that exists on Earth. It consists of about 80 to 100 billion nerve cells, each branch or connected to one another. In addition, there are trillions of support cells called glia that help the neuron thrive and function. The space between two nerve cells is called a synapse and are found in trillions. The activity of these networks of circuits produces millions of firing patterns every second of our lives. And as you can guess, everything about addiction happens in the brain. 3 parts of the brain are involved in addiction: the opioid apparatus, the incentive motivation system, and the self-regulating system of the brain. The opioid apparatus. Among all its uses, one that we must remember in the context of addiction is that it's very important for attachment and bonding, which is particularly important for survival, especially that of young mammals. Endorphin, which are considered as our natural narcotics, are released from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland to the opioid apparatus for pain soothing. They are naturally produced by mammalian parents and infants when they are attached to one another. Endorphin is, in other words, the chemical of love. It is released in young mammals whenever attachment is present. In a mammalian mother, in addition to endorphin, there is the presence of oxytocin to prevent tolerance from the naturally produced endorphin. The absence of these chemicals in the brain of mammalian adults results in a lack of parent-infant attachment. That's why notoriously addictive substances like morphine or heroin, having the same chemical structures as endorphin, are used as substitutes for attachment. Also have in mind that physical and emotional pain are felt in the same area of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. It is fired for both pains. Because of that, an emotional pain like separation or isolation needs soothing by endorphin, be it natural or artificial. If the pain felt by a young mammal like separation is properly addressed, endorphins are released. If not, the child seeks another way out or dies of loneliness. The incentive motivation system, or the dopamine system. This system is important for motivation, as it's written, and for one to be motivated about something, one needs to be curious about that something. But being addicted kills your incentive motivation system to the point where you have no interest in any other form of activity that might be in your own best interest. Dopamine, after its discovery in 1957 by Caitlin Montague, was considered as the pleasure molecule. But later studies found out that this is not the case. Dopamine, to make it clear, is the reason why we get interested in certain activities, not the reason why we enjoy those activities. The euphoria we get comes from the neurotransmitters that get us into the moment, like endorphins or serotonin. Dopamine gives us the pleasure for starting out new activities, but has nothing to do with the pleasure derived from the activity. You know what it means to be high by the moment you're high. You know what sexual orgasm is by the moment you have sex or masturbate to the point of orgasm. Out of that, all what you feel is just a potential high, and only God knows the difference between potentiality and actuality, not the difference between craving and high. Dopamine causes craving, while a present-oriented neurotransmitter like endorphin causes the high. Whenever there is a stimulus, dopamine majorly produced in the ventral tegmental area moves from one neuron to another through the synaptic space until it's reuptake to the originating neuron. It's the time spent in the synaptic space that excites us and gives us this sensation of high. But dopamine does not produce the high. It is, as scientists have it, based on predictions and error. It is the difference between what we predict to experience and what we actually experience. It is responsible for you dreaming of paradise, but is never involved in that paradise. There is pleasure in the pursuit of paradise, but nothing great in paradise itself for dopamine. Dopamine is helpful for all that you expect of life, and it is precisely because you expect good things to happen in life that you think life is worth living, especially if the idealized future is paradise. Tell me, who will not want to die if the certainty of death is paradise? That is the role of dopamine. It is a good ally to move us into the unknown, but the same dopamine which motivates us to move to the moon can create an illusion that's completely out of reach. That's why an important evolutionary behavior like sex can get so addictive. But dopamine knows one thing: more. According to it, there is never enough of anything. If something is in abundance, dopamine will act as if it finishes tomorrow or in the next seconds. The most important thing for dopamine is to maximize the number of resources you have for the future, especially evolutionary important ones. And it does that by making the future look better than the present. Dopamine, however, is not a bad thing in itself. With less dopamine produced by the brain, we feel less motivated and more depressed. The problem comes when dopamine is mostly responsive to substances or behavior that are not useful to us, and that can even be fatal in the long run. It is necessary for our survival. We should not let it get hooked to the wrong masters. The prefrontal cortex, or the self-regulating system. It is the rational part of the brain. It tells us when we should move towards something and when we shouldn't. It tells us what the benefit might be of doing one over the other. This makes it the self-regulating system of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that will argue against the illusory promises of dopamine. But it has its limit when it comes to addiction. Compared to other areas of the brain involved in addiction, it is our only ally and our only chance of getting out of the addiction. Sadly enough, this part of the brain that's supposed to let us move out of the addiction is impaired because of the addiction. Its impairment makes us incapable of making good decisions for ourselves and for those around us, especially when it comes to avoiding the clues related to the addiction or simply to fall into it. What happens next is that the cycle of addiction will be crystal hard to break when this part of the brain is impaired. In the context of addiction, we can consider our brain the battlefield between dopamine and the prefrontal cortex. In an addict, dopamine is the winner. Very important in the addiction process is stress. It gives people more reasons to move into their addictions and present the addictive behavior as the only remedy for the body. We have mentioned that addiction comes as a result of pain, and pain never stops if we are stressed. Stress acts as a catalyst that can either create pain or amplify the previous ones. Let's summarize everything. Almost all substances or behavior can become addictive provided that the following is applied: pain, craving, and relapse. Stress intensifies the pain of the addicts, which intensifies the addiction. The chains of addictions are embedded deep within us, for some of us since childhood. An addiction is in itself very hard to identify, as it is good at disguising itself into something else. At the beginning, the substance or behavior acts like a friend on which we can rely to soothe our pain. But it is the source of the pain and suffering. It makes itself the only way out of the pain, the only remedy to life suffering, and the addicted mind lives in these illusions, perpetuating the pain. Then, the brain, which contains the pain, must find the source of the pain and provide a solution to the pain. To paraphrase Marcel Proust, it is as if the object you are searching for is the thing with which you are searching. An addiction is a demon that slowly introduces itself into your house, and it is just a matter of time for it to get all of you. An addict, to borrow from the Romans, is indebted to himself. He pays the debt through servitude. Let's conclude the first part with these questions. Do you do the evil you didn't want to do, and fail to do the good you wanted to do? Are you an addict? Well, I hope you have an answer. See you next time for part 2, which will be on the various forms of addictions.